Josh, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. It's great to have you.
I'm super excited to be here.
I've loved hearing about all your stories. And when I think of Uber and Travis Kalanick, one thing that always comes to mind is his expression around operating at the red line and continually pushing your limits. And so I'm sure you have some good stories where you push your limits.
For sure. I feel like I'm always operating at red light.
What's the worst?
I wouldn't say that there's anything that's worst about it. Sometimes it's the frustration of everyone on your team and you seeing that they're always at the red line as well and trying to incentivize them and keep them going and seeing that vision that you're seeing and ensuring that you can accomplish everything you need to with that limited amount of resources that you're provided. Like, that's the worst piece of it, more because yes, you'd love to go and give everyone tons of people and time back, but at the same time, then you're just adding cost and adding inefficiency. Like, there's a certain point when you balance your people versus what needs to get done. And if you had too much people, it just adds inefficiency. So that's the worst part of it. The best part of it is just, I love operating like that. Like, every day, something new. And whether it's firefighting or just something else that all of a sudden needs to get done, like, that's kind of fun because it reduces the monotony and makes it so that every day is something new. And it's like, oh great, this is an exciting journey today. What's going to be tomorrow?
That's great. Now, can you walk us through what the IPO process is like?
Oh boy, I could talk about 2 different IPOs, and it differs, and that's because whether or not you are actually prepared. One, when I was at Twitter, they were very much prepared. Correct, I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Twitter was the company, but I did 5 years worth of audits and then moved into the IPO after that, all the quarterization, all those types of things. And they were very, very prepared. They spent tons of time, tons of manpower, and just planned ahead. We had done 3 different, even more than that, but just dry runs to make sure everything worked well. Now, fast forwarding to being at Uber and then kind of running that IPO, very different. We had gone through tons of leadership changes, and then I was asked by this temporary CFO that we had, like, let's start getting prepared and let's do an assessment and let's get things moving so that we can understand how far that end goal is from where we're at now. And so we brought in external Big Four firm that did the assessment, worked with many others, had probably over 400 different items that were on the list of, hey, if you wanted to go public, here's all the things that you should do. I would say most of them weren't anything new that we weren't aware of. And so from there, we created a project management team, or SteerCo, that reported into kind of the A team, or your A directs from the CEO. And we just went through, we prioritized, and honestly, we went from 400 and then said, we don't need to do all 400, like, way too many. Prioritized the long polls, and then went forward and had a pretty rigorous process where we would check in once a week, and then we would have a meeting with them once a week as well. And we'd go through, make sure that the priorities were still priorities to them, and then check in to make sure that they were making progress. And we did that for 6 to 9 months, I want to say, just constantly going through, setting the different phases, what comes in phase 1, phase 2. An IPO has different phases. And so there's things that you need to do that are important post-IPO, because now I'm public. I got to operate like I'm public. I actually have to meet all my deadlines. I have to close my books on time, all those things. So they might not matter as much to you when you're pre-IPO, but post-IPO, all those things come into play, right? And so those you would throw in this kind of your later phase of accomplishing them. Phase 1 are things like, well, I actually need to have a set of financials. I need to have them audited. I need to have quarterly financial statements. Those need to be reviewed because as part of your IPO or S1 process, you're going to be asked for comfort around those numbers as well as your audit firm will be. And so there's a lot of preparation kind of in that initial phase of getting everything together, thinking through, hey, what are my segments as a company? Oh, how about EPS? What do I need? If I had tons of different financing rounds, as well as issued tons of convertible debt, tons of other things, all of that makes a lot of complexity when you get into your EPS calculations. And so getting in front of that is super important. But I could go on and on. There's a massive list basically. But what I would always recommend to someone is going through that process of saying, hey, what are our long poles? What are the things that we need to do? Engaging one of the big four firms who each of them has a consulting arm that does exactly that, will come in, make the assessment, tell you where you're short, and then putting together a team of people that can work on a regular basis to accomplish all of those things. I even, at Thumbtack, one of the things we did is we created a steering committee as well because we were marching towards IPO. Obviously, the market isn't great right now, hopefully someday. But we found that to be super successful, where you had a steering committee that was made up of the executives. And then from there, you had a leader in each of your departments or divisions. G&A, within G&A, you have a legal person. You need someone in the finance team. You need an not investment banker, they're finance people, but someone in IR, investor relations. And each of them have a plate at the table. And with that, they come to the meeting saying, here's what I've done. Here's where I need help. And then you have the executives that are very supportive to say, okay, I see that is something that we need to do. Here's how I'll help you. Or here's, they'll provide some of the guidance or at least arms and legs if you're falling short because of whatever might be happening, whether it be, hey, we got pulled in because of a revenue matter that we're dealing with and we can get to ours. Okay, well, let's get you a contractor for a couple of weeks or something in order to give you the arms and legs to get that accomplished, whatever it might be. And I actually replicated that from Uber, where we had actually we had one that was focused on control specifically, one that was focused on IT controls. And that's because Uber was fully built, internally developed, I should say, thousands and thousands of engineers went into the development of the application and all the systems that fed all the information from a financial perspective. And then we had the overall, hey, for IPO, you need your HR policies in place that support more of a corporate company that is public versus a private company, which sometimes you don't even have documented policies in place. So we split it into those three different committees. Each of those committees had a head, and then all of that committee reported up into myself, and then ultimately we reported into that executive team. And we actually were, because of that, I would say, we got a lot of support from people when we needed it because they realized, different. So we use the green, yellow, red, and we built these beautiful dashboards, and all those things so that everyone can see progress, as well as the red stands out for sure, and your blockers. And so we went through that process and it worked well, and we got the resources as we needed it to ensure that we could be successful. And the fun fact, sorry, I could keep going forever on this, so you could also just cut me off, but one of the fun facts about the Uber IPO is, I don't know if it's a fun fact, but it was during the time when the government shut down when Trump was the president. And if everyone remembers, they're kind of heading into this stalemate where everyone's not willing to do anything, and then the government shut down. And we had just filed our initial S1, and then the government shuts down. And so we're like, okay, well, the SEC is part of the government. And so what are we going to do here? And so we actually built a million different timelines to say, okay, if the government opens this, then this is when we would have to file our next, our responses. Or this is when we could expect our responses. Luckily, what happened was the government opened up and, well, to step back, your financials go stale, right? And so when you file them, if you pass certain periods, hey, a quarter happened, then your financials are seen as stale and you have to update them with new numbers in order for the SEC to continue to have discussions with you and provide comments back and forth still. And so that was the thing we were most worried about is, hey, it's December. Are we going to have to get our quarterly financials for Q1 done? Or are we going to be okay because they'll open up and they'll be like, oh, we'll give you a special card, grace period, because we know that it was our fault in a way. And luckily they said, hey, look, we'll give you a couple correspondents because they opened up right before our financials went stale. And so with that, we were able to go back and forth a couple times and get some comments back and forth. And it kept the process moving. But we definitely had like a million alternate plans saying, what happens if this happens or this happens? And, there's a lot of planning that goes into it.
And then I remember you telling me a story about staying overnight in a hotel across the street.
Yes, there were definitely many instances. I mean, IPOs are not easy, especially when, you're at this behemoth of a company like Uber where you have so much data and information, so many different entities. And when you're trying to like move all of that to get it into a good spot to go public, it was a large lift. So there were definitely, even while I was at Uber, we had certain targets that we wanted to hit. I usually got an Airbnb, and I would stay in the Airbnb from January until at least March, usually, just because I would be working till 1, 2 in the morning and would just, rather than going home and spending, 2 hours commuting back home, quite literally, it was easier to get an Airbnb. But there were definitely other times when, exactly that. We had nice, what are those called? Bean bags in the office. Yep. And some people would come in. I remember I was just passed out on this bean bag and just totally asleep. But someone came in and was like poking me. Josh, are you alive? So that happened. And then there was another time when it actually wasn't IPO related, but it was when we were integrating. We were on Quickbooks and we had 54 entities on Quickbooks. And literally every single day, Quickbooks would crash because we had so much data that we were trying to push in there. And we were running off of Bill.com. Bill.com would sync to QuickBooks, and because we were paying so many bills, it would just break QuickBooks all of a sudden. So then, the CTO of Uber, Tuan, would call up his buddy over at Intuit and be like, hey, can you guys help us out and fix QuickBooks so that we can start working again? And so we got to the point where it's like, okay, we got to get a new ERP system. And so we went with Oracle. And as we're implementing Oracle, we actually had to go half day by half day or day by day and pull the data out in order to get the data out of QuickBooks because there was so much data in there. Versus, I would always recommend, hey, just pull a month at once or whatever. And we couldn't do that. Otherwise, we would break it again. And so we would spend super late nights because we were given a 6-month time period. Usually it would take 12 months to
an Oracle implementation in 6 months.
Yeah. So we said, we're Uber. Let's do it in 6 months. And so we did just that. And we brought in a ton of contractors again, but all they did was literally just pull data and then provide the match between QuickBooks and Oracle to make sure that we had, imported all of the correct data. But there was one particular time I remember it's like 3 a.m. I'm just like, it makes no sense for me to go home right now. And then I was like, well, I want to be frugal for the company as well. So I don't want to go get a hotel for 3 hours until, I had an 8 o'clock meeting. I was like, it makes no sense. So I went and we had a nap room. And so I laid in this nap room. And, I'm just starting to fall asleep and everything's going good. And then all of a sudden, boom, all the lights come on again. And I'm like, what the heck? And it was then that I realized that the lights on the inside of the nap room were also connected to like the triggers or the sensors of motion. And so every hour the guard would walk through and all the lights would pop on and just be like, as I'm dead asleep. And then all of a sudden I'm waking up again and then trying to go back to sleep. That was a long, long night. That was for sure. But I'll never forget that. Don't have anything like that recently, luckily.
Yeah, and Oracle in 6 months, that's just the impossible feat. And so how did you guys plan that out and execute?
Well, a lot of it was by thinking through, okay, how many entities do we need to integrate? Because we actually had international entities, and the international entities were actually kept on a whole different system, which was called like Intact or something like that. And so we had to export out of that. All of those entities. And so at first we're like, okay, we're going to do every single month. Then we'll take that month, we'll compare the month results to what we put into Oracle for that month, and then we'll ensure it all matches. And so that's how we started. It wasn't an issue for all the international entities. I was able to handle us just pulling them up at a time. Like I said, like QuickBooks, it was an issue. We couldn't even pull a day at sometimes. So we had to go account by account and just try to pull out the data. So that was the approach. We brought in a PM, Waldron, from Amsterdam, who came in and he basically said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And he would track every single thing. Okay, for, Uber BV, did we get this month, and did it match? And we would go through this confirmation process to validate and ensure that as we work through. But initially we scoped out and said, how many years of data do we actually need in Oracle? Do we want it to go all the way back to when Uber was founded? Or do we just need like 3 years of data because you only need that much for a good trend? We decided that given the large amounts of data, we would just go with 3, and then we could use the old systems if we ever needed to, which was going back into QuickBooks and saying, so we actually paid like, $500 a month or whatever to keep QuickBooks live in case we ever needed to go back and figure out what the heck happened 3 years ago. But yeah, as we went through that, we were able to move quickly, and then you can assign like, hey, you're going to do BV, you're going to do the, the France entity, and you're going to take the US entity. And so we had individuals assigned to each entity, and then we would pull all the data, and then we had the consultants who would go perform the reconciliation, import it into Oracle, and then we would work month by month. Once we had a month, then we could go through a consolidation process too. And it was then that I would say they could see all the errors that I made in my manual Excel consolidations. It wasn't that bad, but
Mistakes happen though. I know I heard clients off QuickBooks before, and you're like, oh, here we go.
Yeah, especially QuickBooks is not a consolidation tool. So using it to consolidate, it will probably never be the most accurate. And that's why we pulled out of QuickBooks into Excel and consolidated 20 plus currencies and 54 entities all in Excel. Yeah, it was quite the process. Believe me, we found a lot of errors as we, went through that. I still remember the day when I had done it. I went to the CFO at the time. This was like super early, and I owned like technical accounting, consolidations, and all that. Right when I got to Uber, so I consolidated. I'm looking. I'm like, this is great. And the CFO wants to meet with me. I'm like, okay, let's do this. I walk in the room. The first thing he says is, hey, this number right here looks like super weird. It doesn't look right. And I'm like, no. And I don't want to say I made up an excuse, but I basically was like, no, this is why it looks that way and why, it's presented such. Immediately after that meeting, I went back to my desk. I'm like, okay, I got to look at this. And I look, and there was a footing error, and it just didn't carry. I was like, so then I went back to him, it's like that walk of shame. Am I going to get fired today? And so I'm going back to him. I'm like, look, you're right. I looked into it, and this is what happened. He's like, okay, thanks. Yeah, right. He's got that look of, I knew you were wrong, but I just didn't want to tell you. And you learn. It was definitely an experience I'll never forget, and I always double check on all of my work now, even triple check sometimes, just because of that experience. And I don't know. I want to say that's one of life lessons that I always impart to someone. It's good to make mistakes because you learn from them. Don't ever make the same mistake twice.
I like to call those lessons learned the hard way.
Yes.
Because you only do it once.
Yeah.
And you know never to do it again.
Yep. And that's how I try to run my teams always as well. It's like, it's fine to make mistakes because, even think of your kid. They make mistakes. You don't always sit there and, I don't know. Some parents are the helicopter parents that come in and every mistake.
Yeah.
But others are like, yeah, what do you learn from that? And what are we not going to do again? And there's a lot of those at fast-paced companies because you're just trying to strap on Band-Aids and hope that, everything doesn't explode as you work to get better processes in place and you make mistakes.
Yeah. And I can only imagine like going through that Oracle implementation, getting live, what your go live criteria must have been whittled down into critical must-haves. And so what did that go live look like versus where you want it to be eventually?
Yes. I mean, at go live, the things that I would say were lacking that we just didn't have time to do were some of the reporting functionality as well. Like Oracle is, oh no, it's like a behemoth of a tool. It is really not that great, right? It's not so bad mouth Oracle here, but
necessary evil.
yes, this was on premise too. It wasn't the cloud version. Back they didn't have a cloud version back then. It was on premise, and so we just didn't have time to create all the reporting. We made it so they could do a simple just pull P&L that gives you a column, but then we're like, okay, we really need a reporting tools. Then we said, okay, we're going to get HFM. And we went through the process of scoping that out and then adding on HFM. And then that's eventually when I would say we got to a much better spot where we're like, okay, this is much more complete. We can pull data, we can manipulate it in our reporting and have much more ability to actually see what's going on with the business and pull reports that would enable us to do that versus when we went live with Oracle, it's like, oh, great, we can have a consolidated P&L, but can't really dig too much into everything until I can actually find something they can drill in and give me information in a much more legible fashion. I don't know how else to better describe it. But I mean, most of it was just that reporting. I don't think there was really anything. I think we would have loved to have gotten more information in there besides just 3 years. But I think, especially like FP&A, they want, because when you're going from QuickBooks, which is like very basic, and you're moving to Oracle, you have tons more strings within your account, right? So you have the account itself, then you have like department, cost center, all those types of things, and a lot of that we didn't want, but that FP&A wanted, obviously, the FP&A will take everything they can possibly get so they could dice everything up. And so that was one of the other things is we had to make some compromises there because they wanted the full kitchen sink and we weren't willing or didn't have the time with 6 months to do all of that. And so that's why we ended up with 3 years, and then we did end up adding a bunch of the departments and things like that and making sure that we could get all the information possible to enable them to have a lot more historical forecasting ability and by being able to see a lot of the trends and what's going on with the various departments, etc. That's always a give and take between, I would say, finance and accounting is
accounting has
what they want.
Inputting it.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, what's the source of truth? I'm like, right now at Scale, right? It's like, what's the source of truth? I'm like, NetSuite is my source of truth, like not adaptive. That is, you do a lot of stuff in there. All I care about what's in NetSuite. Now, make sure that is correct for GAAP reporting. And then after that, we could talk about whatever else you would like to have as part,
And then, during your time, Uber diversified its revenue a lot and they expanded to Uber Eats and freight and all other kinds of business.
Jump.
Yeah,
bikes and scooters. We even had vehicles. We purchased a ton of vehicles because someone had a brilliant idea, and I honestly think it was a good idea. But let's buy we had, I almost want to say at one point in time, almost $1 billion of vehicles on our books, probably close to that we had purchased. And then the thought process was to lease them to drivers that potentially couldn't, afford to have a car, or we had quality standards. And so someone was like, hey, you can't have a 1994 Honda Accord and use that for Uber. We want it to be a good experience. And so we would lease the cars to them thinking, well, if they drove on the platform in our cars, then we could just not confiscate, but essentially you could just take a little bit of that earnings and then pay off the lease that they would owe for the car. And needless to say, that didn't work out. It's like subprime lending, like, that didn't work out for the U.S. really. And it was basically the same thing. And so eventually that was sold off as well. But yes, sorry. You were talking about different revenue streams, and it got me thinking of all of the crazy things that we did and all the revenue streams. And I was like, oh yeah,
keep
all
going.
the things. Even with Jump, I mean, a lot of this I honestly don't know how much I should be talking about, but that's okay. It makes for great stories. But like with Jump Bikes, it was like, okay, we have bikes and scooters. How are we going to track and make sure like they don't just disappear?
Right.
So we had GPS tracking on. But then what would happen is when the GPS or the battery died, the GPS signal would just disappear. And so, sure, you could get like, okay, where was the last ping? And you could go look for that area. We would definitely find them up in like scooters and bikes up in trees and things like that. Like people would just chuck them up there.
Oh.
So there was an evolution too, though. And I mean, that's what you do as a business. You learn from your mistakes. And so we're like, okay, initially it was like we would have to go out, collect all the bikes, bring them back in, charge them, and then put them back out. And so we had these people that would go and literally drive vans around, pick all of them up and do that. And I was like, wait, this is inefficient and not the,
expensive.
And expensive. So let's make batteries that are swappable, and then we could bring charged batteries and just swap them out. That's a brilliant idea. And so that's what they started doing, and it made it so that one, you could continue to generate revenue from having the scooters out and not bringing them all back in. But two, then we had a lot more inventory that we had to count as a company and keep track of. And so that made accounting even more fun, is trying to track what's the value of the bike, what's the value of the battery. And then we had inventory accounts where even half of the accounting and the internal controls team went out and counted, because at one point in time we got to where we didn't know how much we had.
That always reminds me, it brings me back to my Big Four audit days, inventory counts. So you guys had to, what types of stuff did you have to count?
I mean, luckily, we did count cars. This is the one I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about it, but there was a time, we'll call it early Uber days so that no one can sue Uber for this one, but we didn't even know what our fixed asset ledger, like we had to rebuild the entire fixed asset ledger.
Amen.
We had purchased so many cars. We even had a building that we had purchased, and we just did not know. And so we had to go through this process of, we hired Protivity to come in, and we formulated a plan of how are we going to rebuild our fixed asset ledger. Mm-hmm. And so we went through a process of looking at old invoices to come up with like a cost value, and then we did an average cost value. And then we went and sent people out. We counted the cars. We had cars that were over in Singapore because that was a big Asian market. And then we had cars all over the US. And so we had Protivity, who was, fairly global as well. They went around, they did all these counts. And with the bikes and scooters, we had to go through the same process. And then we went to the buildings. We counted various furniture items. And then with the laptops, we were able to just go and say, hey, but then we also had server rooms. So we had to send people out into these secure data centers and perform counts over like how many servers, how many of the peripherals are there, etc. And from all of that, we then would say, okay, what's the average age based on our ledgers? Mm-hmm. And then we would say, what is the average cost? And we basically reproduced an entire fixed asset ledger. And we were able to get the auditors comfortable with everything that we did. They would ask questions to say, how about this? We could go and give them proof and evidence. But that was like at least a 3 to 4 month process where it was like all hands on deck trying to figure out, because you can't go through an audit if you can't say, oh, here's the amount of fixed assets that I have. And so that was a big journey in and of itself. And I wrote this whole memo to get the auditors comfortable, and I guess it worked. So
that works.
I don't want to say those are some of the pain points that you run into as well. I mean, as a company grows as fast as Uber did, it was next to impossible to get all the processes in place. I mean, you're launching a new city, all of a sudden you're buying a bunch of other things, you're opening a new office, and all of a sudden you have all this furniture. And sure, as an accounting team, you're trying to stay in front of it, but when you're running at the red line and not having all the assets that you need or the people that you need in order to do that, you lose track of some of those things. We did outsource a lot of it over into India to help at that point in time, to where they could actually process the invoices and things like that. But that's where controls come into place, because what we found is that they could potentially enter the same invoice in twice, but what they would do to get around it is they would go and say, oh, if the invoice number is 1234, it would say 123 space 4, and then it would show up as a new invoice. And so then all of a sudden, they're entering the same exact, you could double pay someone because someone had entered in that. And so then we went through a whole new process of saying, okay, how can we mitigate these types of things and stop it? And some of it's education, but some of it was like adding in certain controls, checks and balances. And I mean, and talking about pace, and what happened there. I think a lot of it was because of such a fast-paced culture and environment and so demanding that you just had to get things done, and everyone ran and sprinted. And then at the end of the month, you're like, okay, where do we get everything that we need to be able to figure out what the heck we just purchased, and all that type of stuff. And so that everyone's running around, and that was like early Uber days. And then eventually it was like, okay, we need to put in place, I call it the PPS, the people, process, systems, in order to start getting towards where we could actually go through an IPO process and be an effective public company. But
well, and then there was that whole divestiture as you guys got into China, and then realized that model wouldn't work. Could you shed some color on that journey as well?
Oh yeah. China has one of the largest markets for Ubers in a way. You have a massive, dense population of people that use taxis and other forms of transportation to get around. And so it was on Travis's list of something that we got to go after, and we got to win China, which makes sense. It's probably one of the largest markets in the entire world. And so we went into China and spent tons and tons of money. What we would do in order to win over a new territory usually is you would just pay tons of driver incentives and rider incentives in order to incentivize people to start using your product. I would say the issues that you run into is the potential for fraud. When you're growing so fast, when you're trying to pay everyone anything to try to get them to use your product or drive for you, people are going to take advantage if you don't have the right checks and balances. We did learn that, but we did put in place a lot of checks and balances subsequently, and we're able to mitigate a lot of those things. But yeah, we ended up spending several $billion winning over China, and ultimately DD came and said, hey, look, we're basically going to sit here and fight each other and spend money to fight each other, and why don't we just call a truce and we'll acquire your Chinese side of things. And so we went through that process, negotiated, determined what the value was, and then ultimately divested China. But interesting enough, I was in Amsterdam. I was the EMEA controller at the time when we were divesting China. And so I would have calls early morning, during the day I would work, and then late at night, and just working, every hour of the day basically to work through that divestiture. I mean, it was valued at $9 billion initially, and then I think it became $6 billion, and obviously it fluctuates with the value of DD since we have a stake in it. But yeah, it was quite the process because it was a very different market, and I think that's what we determined or saw, is that each market was very different, and how you would go about either winning over the market or even just gaining drivers. We used to have a launch team that would go out and would hit up all the airports and just sit and talk to all the black car drivers, or try to talk to the taxi drivers or anyone like that, and be like, hey, do you want to drive for Uber? It's this new company, and that's how they want it. So I say that only because, as a business, sometimes you just have to do a lot of different crazy things in order to win over and influence your market. And it's the same goes with accounting. Sometimes in order to just get things done, it means jumping in all hands on deck and doing some crazy things in order to get the books closed. But hey, it works.
And so leading that divestiture, what does that process look like from an accounting standpoint?
That one was actually interesting as well, because we hadn't fully separated, meaning there was a lot of support up at the parent company still for all of the operations that were going on in China. In order to divest, you need to have, a clear set of financials that is they call it a carve out, right? So we had to go through a carve out, and we had to work through the entire set of financials to determine ultimately what the carve out set of financials that DD was receiving as part of the divestiture. And so we brought in I mean, I had a whole team on the technical accounting side, but we also had to bring in other consultants because of just the lift and with everything Uber style, it's like, hey, we got to get this done in like a month. And so it's like, okay, let's see what we can do. And so we went through that process, spent days looking at like different balances, different receivables, and going through kind of every single line item, speaking of, okay, what do we need to do here? And how do we need to do it? What's our time frame? And so we went through a project management process of working down each one of those, assigning them out to different people, and then having them work through. And ultimately, we're able to get to where we had a supportable carve-out set of financials for the historical period that Didi could then leverage in their filings and overall test for acquisition purposes.
And then how does the tangible divestiture look? Because there's the carve-out financials, which is really numbers exercise, but then you had a number of cars and technology and IP and all of that kind of stuff. People.
Honestly, well, with people, they sat down and said, hey, look, we're divesting and now you're going to be a part of DD. We spent plenty of time working with Didi's finance team and accounting team to kind of help them walk them through like what the different accounts were in the process. But then to your point, like from a system perspective, we didn't want Didi to have access to all of the data. So we had to go through a process of kind of, in a way, carving out that data, sticking it onto a separate set of servers and all that type of stuff so that they could still access some of the old data and things like that, which adds value to have some of those things. But it enabled us to put it onto a separate site. And then once we were done, we all almost just closed it down or closed off our access so that then it was kind of almost all theirs subsequent to that. So we had to do that with a lot of different things. And then even like leases or things like that you have for all your different campuses over there in China, we had to go through the process of reassigning and doing those types of things. So that's the process that we went through. Is similar to what you're asking. In a way, you have to think through it as if you're just giving this away. And so what do you need to do in order to give it away? And sometimes it was reassigning different contracts. We had to go through and make a massive list of all the contracts and then go through a reassignment. And then, there was a constant support for at least several months after that until they got comfortable with everything that was going on. And then we were able to kind of move on and just to enjoy either the valuation changes in your P&L that you constantly are reflecting even post divestiture. So,
right.
One of the things that we also had to think about is like we have an investment now and we have to be able to value that investment.
Right.
And so how are we going to get the information timely enough to be able to determine if there's a change in the valuation? And so that was something that we actually worked out as part of the deal economics as well, to ensure that, you don't all of a sudden divest, give them everything, and then you're like, okay, we need information, and they're like, screw you. You don't want that. And so it's something that's very important to work out as part of the deal economics. Like, okay, you're going to give us financial statements every quarter within 30 days of the quarter that will allow us to then figure out what's going on, and then reflect the changes as necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what kind of transition support agreement did you have in place with them?
4 different divestitures, essentially. One was Jump, one was Yandex, one was that. And then with that, basically, we just had a time and materials. That's all it was, literally. It was like, what we'll do is we will charge you time and materials for any support post-divestiture, and we would create a bill, every single one, and then we would just ship over the bill and say, here it is. And sure, there was some back and forth sometimes saying, hey, this, 20 hours of accounting, that doesn't seem right. And so you'd have back and forth, but overall it was pretty easy, seamless. We agreed on a billing format actually to say who, how, what they did, and then we would ship that over every month and then we would get paid.
Yeah. So 4 divestitures. So you must have some good lessons learned in terms of you talked about what are the deal economics. What are some others?
Will there be a divestiture? I mean, we also had several large acquisitions.
Uh-huh.
And I think the planning and timing around it was always critical. And I think what we learned is we also put together almost like a playbook, like a checklist of saying, hey, okay, it's a divestiture. What are we going to need? We're going to need carve-out financials. We're going to need all these types of things in order to be able to, run this process from start to finish. And so we ended up building a checklist and putting that in place, and we would follow that. I would highly recommend that, especially if whether it be an acquisition or a divestiture, there'd be different checklists, but you would still have one, right? For an acquisition, you'd be like, okay, well, I need to look at their assets. I need to look at this. I need to value this. I need to go and get a valuation performed depending on the size. With the divestiture, technically, you potentially also need to go get a valuation performed. But I'm not giving you very good learnings here, but I think that was the main learning is just, it's always going to take more time than you think it will to do whatever. So give yourself a little handicap so that way you can have a little additional time to get through it. Create a playbook so that you make sure that you've checked all the boxes every single time. And then make sure you're communicating on the differences. And what I mean by differences is you could have your US GAAP books, but theirs could be an IFRS. And so you're going to have to go through a transition process and work through that with them as well. And that was one of the not hard learnings, but things I learned is hey, sure, for DD, it was over in China, so therefore it could have been IFRS or local standards. Same with Yandex, but when we had jump bikes or under divestitures there, they were US entities, and so we didn't necessarily have that accounting difference. But at the same time, when you're acquiring, you are also looking at what are their accounting policies? Is it actually the same accounting policy that I followed? And I would venture to say most of the time it was not. Even your thresholds you're using for prepaids or fixed assets or whatever, you're capitalizing at $2,500, they're capitalizing at $500. And so sometimes there's just changes of write-offs of other things that you're making to make the adjustments into your, to be reflective of your actual policies.
Sure. And on the integration side, what would you say was the biggest challenge of integrating your company?
I'd say there's two. I would say on the integration side, one, integrating the people. You want to keep the good people for a period of time. But what happens a lot of times when they announce that there's going to be a divestiture and acquisition, people just are looking for a new job. And so acting quickly on that, I think, is important to make sure that the people because, in pre-deal discussions, you're saying, okay, let's start looking at the good people. Who are your good people in the accounting team? Who are your good people here? And so as you're looking, you want to act quickly to let those good people know that we really want them to be there, because the people with all the knowledge and information are super critical. When after you've acquired them, you don't want to just be left alone and you're like, wait a second, what is this? And then you're looking around and it's crickets because everyone's gone, right? And so making sure that you can bring over the correct people that can add value subsequently. Two, getting ahead of the accounting policies and things like that. Three, performing validation of everything that you're acquiring, performing the due diligence. We always had those things done. But on the integration side, you also have to think about chart of accounts and all those things and how does it map over. And so we had a whole entire team that actually worked and was designated as M&A integration team, and they would go out and they also had the playbook of okay, let's get their chart of accounts. Let's start the mapping process so that we can ensure that we can map. Now let's look at their policies and determine if their revenue policy, if we're on a net basis for Uber, are they on a gross basis? And do we actually believe that they should be on a gross basis? Or if we did an assessment now, would we say it's actually net? And we need to go through adjustments and make all of those changes. And so there's quite a bit of process that goes into an acquisition that people don't necessarily think about. So it just takes time to integrate, update, to make the necessary adjustments. Then again, you have to get the valuation and go through all of those types of things. And so there's a nice long checklist that goes into acquiring or divesting anything. It's not as easy as just, writing it off and calling it goodbye. There's pre and post activities that are taking place and are necessary in order to be successful in all of those things.
But it sounds like you guys had a pretty strong playbook, because I mean, I've seen companies that are very acquisitive and they just bring them on, but they don't integrate them, and they have them operating on standalone, ERPs and just upload them onto traveling ones.
Yes.
It sounds like you guys fully integrated them.
In most instances, we would. But to your point, a lot of companies do it first. Oh, they're on QuickBooks. We'll just keep them on QuickBooks rather than bringing them to Oracle. And then over time, we'll get them to start booking in Oracle. So when we acquired Kareem, who was out of the Middle East, they were slightly larger. And so it wasn't as easy as just saying, okay, yeah, start using everything that we do. They had probably 15, 20 plus entities. And so we had to go through a process of saying, okay, chart of accounts, each of these entities is different. And how do we think about the IFRS accounting side of things and getting that captured versus the US GAAP side, which we needed for all of our, 10Qs, 10Ks and going forward. And so we had to work through the process of saying, what are the gives and takes of us forcing them to just instantly take on and start using Oracle, or do we make it a gradual process? So with that, we actually did work with them. They implemented Oracle Cloud, started using our 7 trial balance, which enabled us to then, leverage everything that they were doing and essentially take the trial balance, integrated it to our Oracle instance, and then use it to consolidate and do all those types of things. So it sped up the process, because if you don't integrate them, and let's say they keep QuickBooks, then you're having to go through that extra steps versus that seamless integration. And each of those extra steps, 1, you need controls around it. 2, are usually manual and can cause errors. And so you're adding in more risk associated with it if you don't fully integrate them. But there are definitely, I would say 50% of the time we would fully integrate and say, okay, we're going to start booking QuickBooks. Whereas if they're very large, you would have more of a step process of, okay, now we'll get them to start using our trial balance. Next, we'll have them start integrating into our Oracle instance and taking those steps. So it just depends. But
What lessons learned, I guess, by country? Because I know China's really tough for ERPs, Brazil, India. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, Brazil, India, all of those, extremely complicated. The amount of taxes and special accounts that you would need associated with just for their different taxes or things that are specific to those countries was very different. We had a full team in India just because of the differences, and the statutory books were so much more complicated, and so we needed that special team just to address all of the different nuances that were there. And we had to do the same with Brazil, which I think everyone knows has one of the more complicated tax structures, and they can pay every single tax for every single thing there is in Brazil. But and that's where some of the decision, do we outsource the kind of statutory reporting and all those special nuance things, and then companies, we did this in many instances where we just send over, here's the US GAAP books. We would work through with them all the differences, and they would go through and make all of those changes over to IFRS. And then they kept a separate set of books. So Oracle was the US GAAP set, and then we'd have a secondary set for its statutory reporting purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the memories. So one of the things that came up while we were kind of moving through the different Uber eras was, hey, you know what we should do is we should make it so that we have our own autonomous vehicles. So that way, you cut the driver out eventually, and then you're saving money because that's where most of your money is going to from each ride. And so we went through this whole process. We first went to Carnegie Mellon, and we actually acquired a piece of the company there, CRI, and with that, we were able to get a lot of technology that helped us with kind of LiDAR imaging, things like that. And then after that, Travis thought, hey, I think he met some, if I remember correctly, and maybe this is just me coming and remembering it from watching Super Pumped versus my actual knowledge, but he was at some sort of conference and bumped into Anthony Lewandowski, and Anthony Lewandowski was someone that came from Google, and he was part of their autonomous vehicles unit that was helping develop all this technology. And Travis was like, hey, come work for Uber. And eventually we did bring Anthony over to Uber, and he kind of helped lead and run a lot of the development around our autonomous vehicles and everything that went into that. And then, yes, I was part of, so we actually acquired him and a few other individuals and things like that, because I had to work on all of the, the acquisition agreements and things like that. So I remember reading this acquisition agreement and thinking like, man, we're totally going to get sued for this. Like, we're basically hiring the person from Google that is in charge of all the autonomous vehicles, and we're asking him to come over and basically replicate that for Uber so that we would be able to then have our own fleet of autonomous vehicles. And this just doesn't seem like it won't end pretty. But hey, we did the acquisition, and then a few years later, Google won a lawsuit against us, and we ended up paying for it. So I can't say that I didn't say that it wasn't going to happen, but it was I would say sometimes in businesses you take risks in order to try to make advancements in areas that you want to focus on, and sometimes they're large risks and end up costing you a bit in the long run. But
wow, that's a big lawsuit, and I can only imagine over the years, there's been a number of scandals, and you led the disclosures and financial reporting for a lot of those years. You must have just been, catching left, right, and center.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of interesting things that I was privileged to over the course of that time. Some are probably still privileged, but it definitely was interesting sitting in a room sometimes and just be like, what are we going to do with this? And you're just like, I don't know what we're going to do with this. Let me think through that and get back to you. There was even a time, going back even with the cars, some of it is like, well, we paid, millions of dollars for these, but now they're telling us that they need millions more in order to deliver our cars. And do we want to pay the millions more or just bite the bullet? I don't know. Do we really need the cars? So you got to go through that cost benefit analysis. But there's definitely a lot of different decisions. And sometimes maybe I'm just too frugal. Like the building in Oakland that's square now, and we own that at one point. We bought it. We're like, oh, we're going to build an Oakland campus. And then, a year later, it's like, okay, that was a terrible idea. We're selling the Oakland building and never even occupied it, but put a lot of money into it. I would say that was one thing that I learned from Uber as well, is like that focus on like your bread and butter versus trying to do everything possible. And we had that tendency, we had Uber Rides, then we had Uber Eats, and we had Uber Freight. But then after that, we had where it's like, oh, let's do alcohol, let's do prescription, let's do, anything, basically delivery services. In New York, you could buy shoes that have them delivered from Nordstrom to you. And there was all these things, and each of those came, but then we even had Uber Works. This was a good one. Whereas hey, all of these drivers have pockets where driving is great and you have people that really want rides. But then in certain instances, there's just downtime. So what can we do with them? Let's rent them out as labor. And so it was restaurants need dishwashers, and restaurants might have someone that didn't show up that needs to do X, Y, and Z. And so let's, we could charge $15 an hour. Sure. Then have them go wash dishes at certain places. And so they're like, oh, we'll just stick them in houses and we'll have them sit there in the houses. And then we'll get a call from the restaurant saying, okay, I need a dishwasher. And then we'll send them off to go wash dishes or whatever, And so we did that for a while. That didn't really work out. And I guess I use that as an example of we were jumping at everything that we could get money from this. We could get money from that. What a great idea this is. And you kind of lost your focus on, what is the core value and principle that you're trying to establish at Uber? And we should stick to that and ensure that we're, always focused on that versus taking your eye off the ball and losing your focus. And, I've tried to take that to scale as well. And in any of my teams, it's okay, what is our focus and what are we trying to accomplish, and just make sure that we don't get distracted by all of those things. You'll have tons of fires that come up, but you need to not let them distract you from like your end goal, because if it does distract you, I mean, in the long run, you're not going to accomplish the goal that you're setting out to. And so, and that's what I have to remind my team constantly as well. It's like, look, this is the, and so what I do now is I actually have weekly meetings, day one, Mondays. It's like, okay, team, this is what we're trying to accomplish this week. And then every single day, I still have to do check-ins with each one of my directs, because it's such a fast-paced environment and everything changes, that I might get marching orders like, 5 o'clock on Monday, and I'm like, oh, we've got to change our whole entire approach to what we need to do. And that doesn't mean that I still don't need to get my audit done, that I still don't need to close the books, but I do have to switch focus quickly in order to be able to help the company continue to operate and meet their needs. That's not to say it's super critical when you're in such an environment that you are communicating very well and also questioning, do you really need this on tomorrow? Because there have been way too many times, whether it be at Uber or whether it be at Scale, where it is so fast paced and everyone's running and they're like, I need this, get this for me, I need this, that you're running around getting all this done, and then you deliver it and then you just sit on it, and you're like, I just worked through the night to get this for you, and then you sat on it for a week, and so basically I've learned that's why I really need to communicate and truly ask, is this really necessary tomorrow, or can I get it to you in a week, or when do you actually need this? And so I've tried to instill that on my team too, because at a fast-paced company, what happens is you have all these operators that are constantly, you don't even know, but they're coming to your team and asking questions and asking for information. And so your role as their leader is to help them ensure that they remain focused, so we don't lose focus on all those other things. Otherwise, they'll work all day, all night, and not even get you what you needed, because they're focused on all the other things that everyone's asking of them. And so I've found that having those meetings, those touch points, even if it's a quick 15 in the morning, whatever it is, can really help drive value, because then your team can flag hey, Billy from from ops is asking for this. Do we really need to get this to him today? Because that's on my list. It's no, let me go and tell Billy he's not getting it. Let me go and tell him that we'll get it to him at a later time. Yeah. To be able to keep your team focused and moving forward on what you're trying to accomplish. And at fast-paced companies, that's one of the most critical things is, maintaining that course and ensuring everyone feels supported and not lost in the fold of everything that's going on in the chaos.
Yeah. And you guys got $8 billion at once.
$1 billion.
Where do you start with that? Do you have a big spreadsheet to budget that out?
No. What's funny is you would think, oh, we just got $1 billion, we're going to go do something. And it was more oh, we just got $1 billion and we're going to just put that in investments and we're not even going to touch any of it. And we're going to continue to operate under the assumption that we need to become profitable. We need to only burn X amount of cash flow, or we need to become cash flow positive. And so I would say the fundraising is more like a rainy day fund, but I don't think we need it. And it was more of, we're going to continue to operate as if none of that even happened, and just try to ensure that we can progress towards that profitability target that we had in the first place. And that we told all the investors, hey, you want to invest in us because we actually are trying to move towards profitability. And this is our growth plan, and this is what we're doing, and versus just going and wasting money. I've seen the opposite. At Uber, I would say it was oh, we got $3 billion, and then, hey, we just went and spent it all on fighting in China or whatever, versus actually saying, hey, we just got $3 billion. Let's, figure out what we're going to do with that. And obviously I wasn't a part of the leadership at that time. So maybe they're we need to raise $3 billion so we could go and fight China for this $3 billion. And that could have been the plan all along.
Right.
I guess in my finance accounting mindset, it's more like, let's just not go waste all this money and let's actually think, pretend you didn't have it. Something I was always taught is like, even if you get all this big cash influx personally, it's like, just set it aside, pretend it didn't happen, pretend you don't have it. Otherwise, you will always know I wasn't a saver, But, I've quickly learned that it's important to just put it aside and pretend it never came. Otherwise, you have a tendency to think, oh, I'm just going to go hire 10 more people, even though you don't need them. And so you actually begin to drive more inefficiencies into your processes and your team. If all of a sudden you just open up a spigot of like, do whatever you want with all of these funds versus ensure that you are very methodical in your operational process and not wasting any of it and it's still driving the efficiency that you're trying to drive before you even had the funds.
I love that. And there's, in my opinion, I've seen so many Bay Area companies that just waste a ton of cash. And so whenever I hear a pre-IPO company trying to get cash flow positive, I'm like, yes, good for you.
Yeah. Well, although a lot of them say that too, right? It's like, oh, we're going to be cash flow positive. That's what we're going for. Well, you have to change certain things in order to actually hit those targets. And so it's great to speak the speak, but it's more important to walk the walk and make sure that you're actually doing things within your organization. And finance, whether people like it or not, is like the example child, It's like, we're going to have an offsite. Okay, well, we're not going to spend a dime on the offsite, We'll eat mac and cheese for lunches so that we could have this offsite and show that we didn't spend that much on our offsite because we're finance, versus like legal's like, oh, we're going to Vegas and we're as a matter of fact, legal I won't say which company, but not the one I'm at, but one of my prior companies, legal's like, we're going to have an offsite in Vegas. And I was like, man, I wish we had that much money to just go and have an offsite in Vegas. Instead, we're having it in the office and using the conference rooms in the office and then doing a scavenger hunt in San Francisco. Like finance.
Building a great culture.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, that's the thing though, is you have to walk the walk. And if you want the operators that you're trying to control with your financial levers to comply, you need to show them that you can actually operate that way and still maintain morale in your team, things like that, even as frugal as we are.
So, in your mind, oh gosh, aside from, saving money with mac and cheese on sites and scavenger hunts, what are some cash flow positive initiatives you guys are tackling first? What's like the biggest bang for your buck that you can do?
That's a great question. The most difficult trick is growth while maintaining at least, a level cost structure. And so how do you get that? I guess that's the magical question that every CEO and CFO asks themselves too, is how do you constantly grow and not increase your costs? What we are doing is, some of it's just around the financial rigor. A lot of companies don't even have a planning process in place, right? When you're a startup, usually you'll have a small forecast and things like that. But what we've done is made it so that we actually have a weekly roll-up to where we are actually looking at what happened revenue-wise, what are the deals that we're closing, what happened cost-wise, because we've actually created SQL queries where all of the databases are capturing all the information associated with our transactions, which was also developed. And then we'll SQL query it, we'll put it like dashboards, and essentially we've created dashboards for like everything. So I could see if like, hey, we're ramping up on a project that we call Flamingo. And as we ramp up on that, we can see how much revenue we're driving versus how much cost we're driving. And if the costs are way outweighing what we're actually obtaining in revenue, then we can kind of ratchet down some of that or look at ways that we can become more effective and efficient in how we're spending some of the money towards that project. And so that's one thing that we've done, honestly, is just more create dashboards. And so on a weekly basis, we go through a process of looking at, those two things, and then also a snapshot of OPEX. And so we'll look and say, okay, how's OPEX looking for this week? And are we going to be over or under plan? And if we're going to be over or under, well, over typically, we'll look at, okay, what are some levers that we can pull in order to be able to reduce our spend and still hit our targets. And so on Monday, we go through a process and we will, we kick it off. We'll get in all of our revenue and cost. And then on Tuesday, we'll build out like, okay, how's the forecast looking now? And so then we'll go through that process of saying, okay, what are levers that we need to start pulling? And so that way by Thursday, when we meet with our CEO and all of the A team, we're saying, okay, well, you need to do this and you need to do this in order for us to kind of move the levers around to meet all of our targets. And then if things, sometimes you have deliveries that get off track and it's like, okay, well, we were supposed to deliver, which would have resulted in X amount of revenue. We're not going to get that anymore. So what can we do? Or you give that news to your CEO and he goes and yells at everyone and tells them to work harder and get the delivery out on time. One of two things, right? And so in our case, though, we typically try to say, okay, if we're not going to deliver on this, then what are some other things or ways that we can get revenue in with the team that we have, or are there new contracts or new deals that can make up the gap? And so we have weekly business reviews, weekly financial reviews, and then we have the monthly forecast, business reviews, and we just go through that kind of cyclical process where we're constantly taking snapshots and seeing what's going on within the business, which enables us to kind of have different levers to pull back and forth as we either need to expand or collapse in different areas. And we use the finance team and to do a lot of that. And then you have the accountants that are kind of your beat counters that say, oh, this is where it ended. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, crap, that's not where it's supposed to end. But what can we do now? And then you work through that process. But I would say that's probably the thing or the cadence that we've gotten into. I'm not going to say there's anything magical because I'm sure any finance person's like, yeah, everyone does that in finance. But it's getting your business to operate and understand that is the cadence, and then understand that as things happen and you need to make changes, that they need to quickly adapt and make those changes in order for us to kind of meet our targets, stay on track, etc. And that also helps you identify kind of your excess spend and cut it back to work towards that profitability that you're looking for. Because if you don't have that, I've had the flip side, and you can shut me down anytime you want. But I've also had the flip side, at Uber, where I feel like it was like spend at all cost. And so a lot of times you didn't have the levers, especially initially. And then at month end, you're trying to pull in everything, figure out what the heck just happened, and trying to make sure that you're still on target. And at times you didn't necessarily care what happened, especially when you got all this new fresh cash. You're like, okay, these are the initiatives that we have. We're going to go full in and do whatever we can. And then at the end of the month, you would take that snapshot and say, okay, well, we really missed on that. We're going to have to make some adjustments. And so getting into that kind of operational cadence helps to drive, in my mind, value to the company, because you're able to quickly make more decisions that will have that financial impact and allow you to move towards that profitability. Versus, on the flip side, we didn't really have a lot of those great processes, and so kept getting stuck saying, oh, we missed this one. Oh, we missed that target. Oh, we missed. And then that adds up quickly. And then you're going back out to the market saying, hey, we need some more money. Shit. I mean, at Uber, we did it multiple times because it was such a rapid growing company. But there comes a time with every company where it's like, okay, we need more money, but no one's going to give it to us anymore because we can't hit our targets. We haven't shown that we can do anything that we keep telling investors. No one's going to give it to us. So I know that didn't really answer your question. But.
No, I love it. And when you said, I feel like what you're building at scale is what I would consider like a best-in-class finance function. We call it future-ready finance function, right? Yeah. And it's really where the finance function is enabling the business to drive important decision makings with real-time analytics and dashboards. And this is like, the creme de la creme of, consulting that everybody wants to strive towards. So it's impressive that you guys are already there. And so I'm asking the question, how do you build a team, a process? Because again, these are all very data intensive. You need a certain skill set. These aren't your typical accountants on your team.
I think some of that is in your interview process. We do a series of different things in order to identify if the people that we are looking at are going to meet those demands and be those types of people. Some of it is, through model building. Like on our finance side, we'll have built models, things like that. On the accounting side, we actually give them data sets and have them work through and make sure they know how to actually kind of work through some of the massive issues of data that we can have on the cost or other side. But then also we interview them for credos. And as part of the credos process, you go 6 levels deep, and that's to ensure that they actually have done what you're going to be asking them to do, and getting concrete examples of that and asking question after question to really dig into that to ensure that they're not just giving you fluff, but they're actually giving you things that can truly going to bring value to your team when you actually add them to the team and require them to do certain things. And so we go through that process. But then I would say we look for people that have been in both very scrappy type startups that have had kind of improvise, might have not been, no offense to Oracle, we'll keep using them though, but like Oracle probably has an accounting team of 500 people or more.
Right.
And someone from there is never going to survive at scale if I brought them into scale. They just wouldn't. It's too fast paced. There's too much lack of structure. And so we target ambiguous questioning as well. Like, tell me a time when you had to deal with an ambiguous situation. How did you approach it? What did you do? What did you do first? And so some of it is the line of questioning that you have to determine if I just drop them in the bucket of scale and say, run, are they going to have the ability to do that because they have the framework that's been built for them previously to do that? Our questioning line in our interview process is extremely rigorous and gets to that, and typically has been pretty successful. After that, it's about training them. And obviously each company is different. So sure, you could just drop them in, but a lot of times that's going to make them more difficult and maybe they will fail. So it's having regular check-ins, but then in my mind, I've tried to get my team to actually say, okay, walk them through one, then have them do it back to you. And then, set them loose and then come back the next day and say, okay, let's walk through what you've done. Let's make sure that it's okay. And then it's creating this more of an operating cadence where people are familiar with each other. What I bring to my teams is kind of like this open, I'm a very open person, like way too open sometimes, but I find that actually makes people more comfortable to come to me and talk to me about, dumb mistakes that they might have made or things like that. If I tell them about a mistake I made, be like, look, I haven't ever done that since because I learned from it and help them realize it's okay. Then they could come to me with mistakes and then we can learn about it together and work through it. And that helps them think through situations and constantly be learning, which helps them further adapt into kind of our scale culture and environment that is quick, fast moving, has fire drills, and you're just like a utility knife constantly going all over the place and having to jump in and do things. And so between interviewing and then just the constant on the jump training and learnings and how I, earlier described the meeting structures and setting out priorities, all those different things help people to, in my mind, be able to adapt, really come in and do well in a culture like Scale or other fast-paced companies like Uber as well.
That's great. And you've had a lot of experience kind of scaling up big teams quickly as well.
Yes. You might have a question there, but I'm going to read in your mind right now, and I'm going to tell you about an experience where we were at Uber and we were hurting. We really, really needed to build a team fast. What we found is in Silicon Valley, I don't want to say it's stable. I don't want to say there's no loyalty or no stability, but in a way, it is and we notice, and nothing, I'm an old dude, right? And nothing against the younger generation, but it's almost like they have no loyalty in sometimes. And so, 6 months in, they're like, you know what? I don't like this. I'm taking off. And then you're stuck back in that hole. And so we were in this process where our teams were running at the red line. And as a result of running there, a lot of people, would just be like, this isn't for me. I'm not willing to do that anymore. And so you'd lose people quickly. So we got to a place where our teams, and then it compounds, right? Like all of a sudden, that person leaves and I'm doing their work. And then I leave and then someone else is doing both of our work. And so it keeps compounding. And so we had to do something quick. So we're like, man, what are we going to do? And that's when we said, how do we go to Dallas? We will hire a ton of people in Dallas. There's not a ton of tech companies there. So we'll be able to keep the resources incentivized because they're like, hey, this crazy, awesome tech company, you got to work for it now instead of some airline or some oil rig company, So we went in, we said, okay, we're going to hire 20 people in Dallas and we're going to do it basically over a weekend or over a week. And so we got all the resumes, we screened out everyone that we wanted to, and then we went down for 3 days in total, and we interviewed probably 60 plus individuals over that time. We had 6 people that flew out, and they just went like room to room and swapped around essentially, and we all interviewed them. End of the day, we would go to I don't want to say a dartboard. It wasn't a dartboard. Yeah, can you imagine this one and that one? No, it was, we had a dry erase board and we basically put them all on there and we would sit there and I don't want to say we would rank them, but we would say like, who's your number one? Who's your number two? Yeah. And we would sit there, I really like this. And then we would work through and discuss what we saw out of the interview process. And then, by day 2, we went through the same process. And then day 3, we didn't have anyone. We actually just tried to wrap up, finalize, and make sure we're all aligned. These are the people we're going to move forward with. And then, we walked out of there making 20 offers. And within a month and a half time, we had like a whole entire team out there for our accounting team up and running. Then from there, what we did is we actually had on board 20 people, right? And so we had each team member assigned to a different training task. Okay, you're going to train them how to use Oracle. And so then we had someone that created an entire video on how to use Oracle and the accounting streams and all those types of things. Then we had someone, okay, you need to train them on our accrual process. And so then we did the same thing. And so we created all these different almost like desktop procedures and then videos. And with each of those, we had 2 days when they were onboarded where they just watched all the videos. And then after they got done with all the videos, we would fly team members out for a week to 2 weeks at a time. And they would just work with the team and make sure that they got trained on a different topic, and then would work, and review their work and make sure that they were all doing what they needed to. And they would just sit there and rotate team members. And so people from San Francisco, a couple at a time, just fly out and then just work to get them onboarded. And we found that they got onboarded pretty quickly, trained up and started having a good impact pretty quickly. I wish we would have been in need of that many roles at scale to where I could do that, because we have continued to look at we continue to see that the San Francisco Bay Area talent that can be very difficult to break into and maintain someone for a long period of time that isn't going to leave in a year and a half, 2 years. And we found that Dallas is very stable. Several of the people I know that I hired, and this was 7 years ago, probably at this point, are still at the Uber in the Dallas office. And so we've also looked at that at scale. Like, do we want to build the Dallas office like we did at Uber and that be successful? And just determined right now, if we only have 2 or 3 people, they would kind of feel alienated and by themselves versus all of a sudden having 20 people in an office. Like, you have an office basically, and you could feel that camaraderie and them.
And now, what are your viewpoints on, Dallas is easier to manage, it's a couple hours away, versus an offshore shared services center? Have you had experience managing those?
Yeah, so when I was at Uber as well, and even at Thumbtack, and we've tried it at scale, although still working on the hiccups, I would say. But at Uber, because we were probably transacting at the time 10,000 invoices maybe a month or something, like just tons of invoices. And you could either just continue to hire millions of people, or you could look at a solution from a system perspective. It was a mix of both for us. And so we brought in a shared service center. And so we worked with Accenture to partner up. And we went through a process of hiring probably 250 like AR, AP type people for that side. And then what we found is for shared services, they work well for like transaction volume based stuff. But if you want them to make an accrual that requires judgment, they're usually not going to be the best or the appropriate kind of workforce to be doing those things. And so we in total probably had 500 people that were working across the AP/AR and general accounting functions to do the transaction work. Even with that, we would still go through a process of interviewing, making sure that we were comfortable with them. And then we had groups of people that would still fly out to India. It was a different group. Probably once a month, we would have different people that would be flying out just to constantly have that touch base and ensuring that, one, they feel like they're part of the team, even though they are at a shared service center. Two, they continue to receive the appropriate training, attention, and input that is necessary in order to be successful with your team. And so, standing it up, we just needed a partner. And so that's why we moved to Accenture, because they were big enough to be able to support. At Thumbtack, I came in and we already had a Philippines, like one person in the Philippines, and we had an operational center there. And so I said, okay, well, let's build out and hire more people in the Philippines. And so as our accounting needs kind of continued to, okay, we need more people, it was like, okay, let's look at the Philippines. And so we went straight there. We actually tapped the resource that we had that was already there and said, do you have good people? And then we actually opened up and just like a standard recruiting process. We had hundreds of applications coming in saying, we'd love to work here. And as a result, we were able to hire another 5 people out there. And just the other day, they were in town. And so I met up with them and said hi. It was great. Still keep in touch with them. On the Scale side, we've tried the same. We said, okay, well, we want low-cost resources, and it hasn't worked the same. And some of that, I would say, is because we still are like maturing our processes. And so typically a shared service center, I compare it to like RPA, right? With RPA, you kind of have, I call it the square of RPA. You have the rules. If it falls outside the rules, it's like hitting your head against the wall because it cannot do it.
Yeah.
And similar with a shared service center, if you have a desktop procedure, if you have things like that, they'll be able to follow it and you will not have issues. But if it's outside of that desktop procedure, or if it's something else that they just, I would have to guess and I don't know how to guess, so I'm just stuck. You get to a point where it's no longer efficient. And so that's what we're finding at Scale is one, obviously we don't have desktop procedures. We're still running by the seat of our pants on the red line and trying to get everything done. And since there's not that structure that, call it a shared service center resource, would be able to kind of thrive in, they haven't thrived. And it's been a struggle finding a person that is trained like we train people in the US to really kind of think outside the box and just go at it, do everything. And so we're still struggling there now. And honestly trying to think, do I pull out of there and just not use it until we can get more structure? Or do I continue to just have them do my cash reconciliations instead of my cash template, wire money somewhere? And like how much value and time are they saving me? And it's kind of been doing that assessment. Still up in the air, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah. And then you talked a little bit about RPA automation, which I know you're a big fan of. Talk to me a little bit about that in terms of your plans for how to scale without scaling with people and leveraging automation.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to my PPS system, people. So it's all about getting the right people, which we've discussed. Process. It is about building out scalable processes and then systems. And so that's where I'd say your question comes into play is on the S side. And so I'll be honest, like probably on a daily basis, I have at least 5 inbound emails saying, hey, I'm from blank company. I was about to mention someone. I was like, but better not, because they're annoying. But it's like, hey, I'm from this company. I want to sell you my product. We're using AI, and we can save you so much time and money. If I went and listened to every single one of those people's speeches to me, tell me how they're going to save me money and what they do, it's a complete waste of my time. And so the approach that I typically take into my career is saying, okay, we need to stack rank our issues. And it's like, okay, what are we trying to solve for first versus saying, what is your solution? And then let me see where I could put it into my process. And so right now what we're doing is we did do that on the P2P side. Mm-hmm. We had like 5 different systems, and each territory or region, whether we have Mexico and Philippines and Germany and all these other FTE hubs, that we needed to capture the P2P side of things. We had like spreadsheets and Google Docs that we were using for Mexico. And then we had to call it, another tool for Germany because the Bill.com or whatever couldn't handle, it's not Bill.com because that's a different system, but it couldn't handle, the international currencies and whatnot. And so we went and we identified a solution and we implemented the solution that they helped to implement that system. And actually it saved us a ton of time and it's helped us to scale more. At the time, we had 3 AP accountants that did all TAP and all of our P2B. And we've been able to maintain that and haven't had to add any more, even though we've quadrupled in size over the 2 years that I've been there, including our spend and the number of invoices processing, etc. And I give that example because that, to me, is an example of how you can use a solution to scale and support scale versus constantly adding more and more people at your problem. And that's how we go about our process. And on a quarterly basis, we have a meeting. We get together and say, okay, what are the largest pain points that have come out of this last quarter? Almost like a retro is what we call it. We'll do a retro and say, okay, these are our pain points. How are we going to solve for them? And that's where we start going and looking at different solutions. In particular, right now, we're very highly interested in AI solutions. We've been looking at tools. There's a tool that will take and leverage AI. It'll ingest all of your accounting transactions from this month and last month. And then it will prepare a flux for you and tell you what the differences are. Like, I think of where is one of the areas that I spend a lot of my team's time is trying to figure out what the heck changed. Oh, AR went up 500,000. Well, what the heck drove that? AR is a little easier, but things like your accruals, like what did you accrue last month versus this month, and why did it change? And if you have hundreds of different customers that you're trying to accrue for, it's very difficult to go and write or develop that fluctuation. Yeah. And then add in the business reason. And so we're looking at different tools that would do that at the same time. That's just an example. And so that's kind of how our approach to leveraging or putting in place systems or things such as RPA, which RPA had its purpose. I would say it's irrelevant in my mind now with AI and things that can do so much more than that. Another thing that we're looking at currently is like contract summary tools in a way. So we signed so many different contracts with so many different people. And in accounting, you have to capture and make sure that all that's reflected, right? And the last thing you want to do is sit there and go through ironclad one contract at a time and say, oh, how is this going to impact my accounting? So there are some amazing tools out there that will literally scan through every single contract within a matter of minutes. And you can even add the fields that you want it to look for and summarize for you. And then it will return essentially like an Excel schedule or worksheet that tells you, okay, here's your term, here's your tenant improvement allowance, whatever else. They have it for revenue, they have it for leases, they have it for any other types of contracts. And that the power behind tools like that and the automation that it can bring is enormous, right? Like, it's endless. There are some nuances to that, I would say. One is around security. With everything, when you're implementing a new tool, you need to do the UAT, test, and then as you're executing the contract, you want to make sure you're looking at who owns what, because you don't want them to obtain all of this confidential information of yours and then have the right to build all these derivatives and use it to essentially go out and pitch to other customers in one business because they have all this information that they shouldn't be using. And so that's one thing that's critical at working in an AI company, knowing that as you're looking at working with AI companies, you need to be very focused on the security around the information that you're going to be ingesting into their tools, etc.
And so what specific kind of clauses or tactical recommendations can you make for other people?
You need to know who you're dealing with. Some are just almost a pass-through, and they are leveraging AI from OpenAI or Anthropic, and they're using their models built into their own AI platforms. And so what you're looking at is where's the information flowing? And so you're getting different, you might know this better than I, it's like a digital security, and it talks about the ownership associated with the information. And so you're looking at those types of things, and there should be clauses within the contract that say that you can't make a derivative using our data, or we own all the rights to the derivatives that are made, and those aren't to be used for other customers. It's ensuring that you're putting in place clauses that will enable you to continue to maintain and operate off of that data and the new models that are being generated as a result of it essentially consuming all of your data. And putting in those clauses helps add that protection.
And now, what I love about ScaleAI, I was doing some YouTube videos of our CEO, and I love how he explains the concept of the data infrastructure and basically the 3 layers of data and how to think about it. Yeah. I'd love for you could probably articulate it much better than I can.
I don't know if I can. Well, first you start with AI, right? So within AI, there's 3 different pieces of AI. Mm-hmm. You have your compute side, and if I said compute, what are you gonna say? NVIDIA.
NVIDIA,
right?
Yes.
So the compute side, all the processing power goes through NVIDIA. Then you have call it the algorithm or model side. The algorithm side of things, who are the 2 largest companies, OpenAI and Anthropic. Mm-hmm. So when you think about those 2 pieces, you know who the common players are. Then the third piece is data infrastructure. And that's where ScaleAI comes into play, is we add in that third piece, and between the 3, you have like a fully operating AI model. I'll be honest, I can't necessarily articulate all the 3 layers of the data infrastructure, but essentially the way that I think about it is you have the computing and the modeling, but you need the data to operate your models. And if I gave you, let's take the mind of a 2-year-old, and you use the mind of a 2-year-old as the data that's kind of inputting into your model. How well is that going to work? If you ask a 2-year-old, hey, where do you want to go? Let's go to McDonald's and get a Happy Meal, right? Versus if I'm an adult and I'm saying, hey, I would like to go and eat, give me a place to eat, and I don't want to go to McDonald's. So then take a fully grown adult that's 45 years of age and use their brain to develop a model. There's a lot more information there, and so that model is going to be much more efficient. It's going to be much more accurate, and you'll be able to get a lot more value out of that model. And so the data infrastructure side of things is essentially what we call helping to fine-tune the underlying data associated with models and algorithms that are running off of your compute. And so what we do is we have thousands of taskers that are trained in different specialties. One, it could be nursing, it could be engineering, and then you have different language models as well. And so you have, whether it's Arabic, Spanish, whatever. And so we will essentially go out and interview and then find all these people. And then they are the ones that have, call it the data, that then helps to develop and fine tune these models and make them smarter and smarter and smarter. And so that's where ScaleAI kind of falls in the AI ecosystem, is a company could come to us and ask for a model around, nursing as an example, or one of our public partnerships is with Chegg. And I don't know if you know who Chegg is, but they essentially, help college students and helps learning of students and things like that at different age groups. And so what we do is we've actually been asked to help build models that they can then use to, if your college student wants to learn more about nursing, can go into this model and sit there and interact with it and ask us questions, then being taught essentially. And so that's an example of like ways that a customer could be leveraging the modeling and the data that we're helping to, bring to market and provide to them, which is what they run off of in order to make money in a way.
Yeah, just getting that kind of like, what is ScaleAI? What do you guys do? How do you view it? How do you make money?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy too. We're definitely the largest, I don't want to say the best, but when you think of those three AI components, like ScaleAI is the leader of data infrastructure. They're like the NVIDIA of data infrastructure. We want to be as big as NVIDIA and hope someday we will be. But essentially you think of it as there's not a lot of, it would be very difficult to build a platform where you essentially have a prompt and then a response. And you have this whole entire process that you have taskers going through and updating, providing responses. Because if you think about a model, you want a question and then you want an exact answer. And so what we're doing is helping to provide the inputs for all of that and fine tune them to make it so that it's smarter and smarter. I would say an example that I used, and I used our software. I went in and I said, hey, I have my Uber team from Amsterdam. It's coming in town. They want to have brunch on Saturday. And I was like, I'm not from San Francisco. I'm from the cornfields of Brentwood. I don't know where to go in San Francisco to have brunch. So I went in and I asked the question. I said, name the top 5 places for brunch on a Saturday. And it gave me a response. I went, I looked it up, and 4 out of the 5 were closed post-COVID and never opened up again. I was like, well, this is garbage. Like, I'm stuck with one. So then I'm just Googling after that and saying, where can I find? Now, fast forward, done the same thing. And we have much more fine-tuned it to the point where I've asked the same question, and it gives me like 5 very nice places that I could go and have brunch. And that's because that expertise that we bring through the different taskers is helping to really drive that value and bring in, call it the expert and the efficiency that will help any business be able to leverage that model and that data to be able to drive results that they're needing. And that's how we're trying to provide, or we're definitely providing value to many different companies and involved with a lot of the large companies and helping to bring a lot of those efficiencies and drive a lot of the model building that they're looking for and helping there. So it's exciting. It's a lot of fun.
So then what's next for you? Are you looking, you've got such incredible experience. Are you sitting on boards right now or helping advise other companies?
Yeah, funny that you mentioned that, but yeah, about 6 months ago, so I was asked to be on the Cream audit committee. Cream was actually one of the companies that we acquired while we were at Uber, and a lot of the finance team reported into me. And so subsequent to leaving Uber, they kind of split into 2 different companies, and one of the companies that is kind of more investor run was looking to form an audit committee and start the process, and because they had been carved out, as we had referred to earlier. And so, yeah, they came and they asked me if I was on the audit committee because of kind of a lot of what we had discussed, just that ability to kind of think through financial statements and ask questions about processes and make sure that they are the appropriate processes. I've been involved heavily in kind of control side of things. And then one of the things that we're even looking at is like, oh, can we automate or add AI into some of the processes, things like that. And so it's definitely something I'm currently interested in, is just kind of being involved more and like, I guess as a individual within kind of finance and accounting, one of the things that drives a lot of like, gives me a feeling of satisfaction is being able to see like large impacts that you're making. And sure, I see that at scale, but I love the opportunity to go and work with other companies or other teams and just thinking through like ways that they could either leverage AI or ways that they can enhance processes or things like that. Matter of fact, I just did that last Friday. I had a call and he was asking me like all about our planning process and our weekly, metric meetings and trying to replicate those sorts of things and how do you go about it. So, when you think about it, you don't think, oh, I've got all this great knowledge and information, but then when you're talking and you're like, wow, I've learned all these things that I didn't even remember or know that I know, but you just kind of know them naturally. And being able to share that with others and just think through situations and how to approach things, love that type of stuff. Honestly, what led me back to Scale is knowing that, when I got there, we were on a cash-based accounting. Okay, it's a big hill to climb to get to, GAAP accounting and things like that. And those are the things that are a lot of fun. It's trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B and make things more scalable and sustainable. So, for sure.
Oh, that's great. Well, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a great place. jw@scale.com.
We're gonna a lot more spam.
Yeah. No, if you reach out through LinkedIn, I am typically pretty good to respond within a day or two of when I get messages, but I would definitely put some information as to why you're reaching out. Like I said, I get probably 20 sales calls a week through LinkedIn as well. Come listen to this and definitely have to block those ones.
And from the sounds of it, I try to reconcile Josh down at 4 with, your work ethic. And so what do you do in your downtime?
Oh boy, I don't have a whole lot of downtime. My wife hates it because it's because I can't I don't know if I was raised this way. And I think I probably was, but I was raised to work hard. And so as a result of that, I can't relax. And my wife, that's good. So I say my wife hates it because I'll be sitting at home and I'm just looking around holy crap, what can I do? I can't just sit here on the couch. She's like, you need to relax. I'm like, relaxing to me is doing something that's not work then, but it's still work. I would love to go. And so I've got a cabin up in Arnold. And so in my free time right now, what I'm doing is I actually built, a different shelter, a garage that has a game room above it. And we knocked down all these trees, not a ton, but some in order to make space for it. And so now I'm cutting up all these trees and I've got a log splitter that I spent time cutting up all the logs for the firewood for the winters. And then I also, I've got 2 boys and so I've got season passes and we have the Epic Pass. And so we'll go up to Kirkwood and then go to Park City. And they tried getting into snowboarding like me, but just not feeling it. They'll stick to their skiing, but we have a lot of fun doing that. Definitely spending time with them is probably what I try to do in my pastime the most. For sure.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you again for all your time. It's been very enlightening and I've learned a lot. So I appreciate you.
Appreciate you having me. I always enjoyed our partnership with you and your team and appreciate the opportunity to be on and speak my mind with you. It's been great.
Guys, thank you.